What if chaos didn't win by conquering the galaxy, but by changing the rules of reality itself? What if the gods of the warp didn't need armies or demons, because they had already learned the most powerful weapon in the universe, fear? Imagine a galaxy where humanity finally learns to live without worship, without faith, without the Emperor. A galaxy where the warp is no longer a storm, but a tool. Now imagine the gods realizing they are starving, and choosing to destroy the universe rather than be ignored. This is not a story about victory. This is a story about what happens when chaos wins, and the price of that victory is the end of everything you believed was true. What if the war was never meant to be won, only endured for as long as possible? No alarms marked the beginning. No final battle line was drawn. No prophecy was fulfilled in fire or light. If chaos truly won, it did not do so with a scream, but with a pause so long that the galaxy forgot what silence used to mean. This is not the story of a single moment where everything broke. This is the story of how reality slowly realized it was already lost. There are futures the Imperium refuses to record, not because they are impossible, but because they are too complete. Futures where there is no rebellion left to crush, no heresy left to burn, no hope left to betray. Futures where the question is no longer how humanity survives, but whether survival still has meaning. This is one of those futures. For 10,000 years, humanity believed it understood chaos. It gave it names, gods, symbols, rituals. It framed chaos as an enemy that could be fought, resisted, starved. The ecclesiarchy preached that faith was armor. The Inquisition believed vigilance was enough. The Astartes believed strength would carry them through eternity. And above all, humanity believed that as long as the Emperor endured, the galaxy itself would hold together. But chaos was never trying to win in the way the Imperium understood victory. It was never racing, never desperate, never afraid of defeat. Chaos waited. Across the stars, war still raged as it always had. Bolters thundered, titans marched, entire worlds burned in the name of survival. From a distance, nothing looked different. The Imperium still called this age one of endless war, because it lacked the imagination to call it what it truly was, the last age of resistance. An age defined not by strength, but by inertia, by a refusal to accept that the struggle itself was the only thing keeping the universe intact. Even the warp seemed restless in unfamiliar ways. Not more violent, quieter. Storms lingered longer, but moved less. Demonic incursions became strangely precise. Whole systems fell into madness without a single summoning circle ever being drawn. On some worlds, the population turned to worship without knowing who they were praying to. On others, the prayers simply stopped working. Astropaths began reporting anomalies they could not explain. Messages arrived fractured, looping back on themselves, or referencing events that had not yet occurred. Some spoke of hearing thoughts that were not hostile, not seductive, but patient. As if something vast was listening, not to words, but to exhaustion. The Imperium dismissed these signs as variants. It always did. A civilization built on denial could not afford curiosity. When the Administratum noticed that compliance rates were dropping across dozens of sectors, it blamed logistics. When entire regiments failed to arrive at mustering points, it blamed the warp. When planets went dark without sending distress calls, it blamed rebellion. Chaos did not need to hide. It only needed the Imperium to keep lying to itself. On Terra, the Golden Throne continued to hum, its ancient machinery devouring. Lives at the same relentless pace it always had. To the priests who tended it, this constancy was proof of stability. To the Emperor, what little of him still perceived time, it was a countdown without numbers. The Astronomicon still burned, but its light no longer cut cleanly through the void. Navigators spoke of shadows inside the beam, like stains in the soul of the galaxy itself. Faith remained strong, but it had begun to change shape. Where once belief hardened resolve, it now carried desperation. The prayers grew louder, longer, more frantic. The ecclesiarchy called this devotion. Chaos recognized it as nourishment. Every plea for salvation that went unanswered chipped away at certainty. Every miracle that failed forced belief to twist inward, becoming obsession rather than strength. Humanity did not notice the difference, but the warp did. Even the Space Marines felt it. Veterans of 10,000 wars began to experience moments of hesitation, brief, almost imperceptible pauses before battle. Not fear, not doubt in their cause. Something worse. A quiet sense that the war itself no longer knew why it was being fought. Chaplains intensified their rites. Librarians redoubled their meditations. None of them spoke aloud the thought that crept into their minds during the long void transits between campaigns. What if this never ends because it was never supposed to? Chaos had learned a lesson across millennia of failure. Every black crusade that broke itself against imperial defenses. Every demon banished. Every champion slain. Raw force only strengthened the walls it battered. Hatred alone could not topple a civilization built on hatred. Violence was the Imperium's native language. It could speak it forever. So chaos stopped shouting. The gods withdrew their champions not out of weakness, but calculation. The great invasion slowed, not ceased, just softened. Enough to keep the Imperium fighting, but not enough to force unity. Instead of conquest, chaos turned to cultivation. Instead of tearing reality open, it let reality rot from within. Systems collapsed under the weight of their own neglect. Governors turned to forbidden bargains not out of ambition, but exhaustion. Entire cultures slid into damnation without ever realizing they had crossed a line. And the warp responded, not with fury, but with coherence. Where once the Imperium was a howling storm of contradiction, it began to show patterns. Currents stabilized, pathways repeated, demons manifested with less distortion, more clarity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was unprecedented. The warp was learning restraint, learning efficiency, learning how to exist alongside reality, rather than constantly crashing into it. This should have terrified the galaxy. Instead, it went unnoticed. The Imperium still measured victory in worlds reclaimed and enemies slain. It did not measure the slow erosion of meaning. It did not see that loyalty was becoming conditional, that faith was becoming transactional, that survival itself was becoming the only remaining virtue. A civilization that once dreamed of dominion now fought only to delay extinction, and called that hope. Somewhere beyond time, the gods of chaos watched this process unfold without celebration. Khorne did not roar. Tzeentch did not laugh. Nurgle did not croon. Slaanesh did not whisper. They did not need to. The game had changed, and for the first time since the birth of the warp, all of them understood the same truth. The Imperium was no longer resisting chaos. It was sustaining it, and so the final age did not begin with betrayal, or revelation, or apocalypse. It began with a universe too tired to imagine an alternative. A galaxy that mistook endless war for stability. A species that believed survival was the same thing as victory. If chaos were ever to win, it would not do so by destroying humanity. It would do so by convincing humanity that nothing else was possible. And by the time anyone understood the truth, the question would no longer be how do we stop it? The question would be whether there was still anything left worth saving at all. What happens when an enemy realizes it has all the time in the universe? The wars did not stop. That was the first illusion. From the outside, the galaxy still looked exactly as it always had, aflame, screaming, devouring itself one system at a time. Imperial propaganda continued to broadcast victories that no one could verify. Crusades were declared, enemy strongholds were shattered, names were carved into stone and forgotten just as quickly. To most, it seemed as though chaos had merely been pushed back again, forced into the shadows where it belonged. But chaos was no longer rushing to meet the Imperium on the battlefield. For the first time since its awakening, chaos slowed its pulse. The great crusades from the Eye of Terror grew fewer. Not weaker, just rarer. There were no galaxy-shaking declarations, no unified banners of damnation sweeping across sectors in fire and madness. Instead, conflict became strangely asymmetrical. A shrine world would collapse into anarchy without warning. A forge world would quietly cease production, its tech priests lost to rituals they insisted were purely mechanical in nature. A fleet would vanish mid-translation, not torn apart by the warp, but absorbed, repurposed, its crews emerging years later with altered loyalties and no memory of the moment they turned. Chaos had learned that pressure creates resistance. Absence creates collapse. Where once demonic legions had screamed their arrival, now corruption seeped in wordlessly. Administrators adjusted numbers to make impossible quotas appear attainable. Planetary governors extended emergency powers that were never relinquished. Noble houses clung to survival with compromises so small they barely registered as sins. No blood was spilled at first. No icons defaced. No hymns inverted. Chaos no longer demanded worship. It allowed convenience. Entire systems fell without a single bolt round fired. The Inquisition noticed the pattern too late, and misunderstood it entirely. They classified these losses as administrative failures, not heretical ones. There were no open cult uprisings to purge. No demonic manifestations to justify exterminatus. The worlds were still loyal, still compliant, still flying imperial banners. They simply no longer mattered. Their tithes dwindled, their populations stagnated, their faith hollowed out, becoming ritual without conviction. Chaos did not claim these worlds. It abandoned them, and abandonment was something the Imperium had no doctrine for. Within the warp, something unprecedented occurred. The Immaterium, once defined by endless contradiction and volatility, began to organize itself around long-term currents rather than sudden eruptions. The tides still raged, but they raged predictably. For demons, this was liberation. They no longer burned out in moments of excess. They endured. They remembered. Some even learned restraint, a concept that would have been unthinkable in earlier ages. The gods watched their servants with something approaching interest. Khorne found that endless slaughter dulled itself. When blood flowed without meaning, even rage lost its edge. So he allowed wars to end, not in peace, but in stalemate. Eternal sieges. Generations born into trenches that never moved. Violence stripped of climax. Hatred without release. Nurgle realized that despair ripened best when it was slow. When disease became endemic rather than catastrophic. When suffering turned mundane. His plagues no longer swept through populations in glorious waves of decay. They lingered, mutated, became part of daily life. People stopped praying for cures and began planning around illness instead. Tzeentch, master of change, saw that too much change led to instability. So he narrowed the possible futures, reduced the branches of fate, made prophecy easier, not because the future was clearer, but because it had fewer paths left to take. Choice became illusion. Schemes no longer needed complexity when inevitability did the work. Even Slaanesh adapted. Excess lost its potency when everything was already extreme. So pleasure became numbness. Sensation flattened. Desire turned inward, devouring itself. Whole cultures drowned not in indulgence, but in boredom so profound it erased purpose. The warp responded to this alignment with something terrifying. It calmed, not peaceful, never peaceful, but stable. The Immaterium stopped behaving like a storm and began behaving like an ecosystem. Its predators learned patience. Its parasites learned efficiency. Its gods learned that domination was not achieved by force, but by dependency. Reality no longer recoiled from chaos. It adapted to it, and adaptation is the first step toward surrender. The Imperium mistook this lull for progress. Warp travel became marginally safer along certain routes. Demonic incursions decreased in frequency. Some sectors even experienced something dangerously close to recovery. Crops stabilized. Trade resumed. Faith softened from fanaticism into routine. Humanity allowed itself to believe that perhaps the long war had entered a manageable phase. That belief was the greatest gift chaos had ever received. Because a civilization that believes it can endure forever stops preparing for an ending. The High Lords debated strategy, unaware that strategy no longer mattered. Generals planned campaigns against enemies who were no longer interested in winning battles. The Imperium continued to sharpen its swords, never realizing that chaos had stopped bringing shields. It brought time instead. In quiet corners of the galaxy, cult leaders were no longer visionaries or madmen. They were administrators, logisticians, clerks who understood supply lines better than scripture. Their rituals were indistinguishable from governance. Their sacrifices were measured in efficiency losses rather than blood. Chaos did not spread through screams anymore, it spread through policy. And beneath it all, something fundamental shifted in the relationship between humanity and the warp. For millennia, the Immaterium had been shaped by emotion, rage, hope, fear, devotion. Now it began shaping those emotions in return, not through possession or madness, but through subtle reinforcement. Hopeless worlds bred despair, stagnant societies bred apathy, endless war bred numbness. Humanity was feeding chaos automatically, without intent, without belief. The gods no longer needed worshippers. They had a civilization. By the time the Imperium noticed that chaos was no longer launching grand offensives, it assumed the enemy was weak. By the time it realized the offensives had never been the point, the galaxy had already adjusted to a new normal, one where resistance existed only to maintain the system that was consuming it. Chaos did not need to conquer the Imperium. It needed the Imperium to keep surviving exactly as it was. And as the centuries passed, as victories rang hollow and losses became statistics, the most dangerous realization never reached Terra, never reached the High Lords, never reached the masses praying beneath cathedral spires. Chaos was no longer fighting the war. It was letting the Imperium fight it forever. And in that endless struggle, Chaos had finally found something far more powerful than victory. It had found permanence. What happens when the universe itself begins to feel wrong? At first, no one could say exactly when the sensation began. There was no single date recorded in the archives, no proclamation issued from Terra, no astropathic warning broadcast across the stars. The galaxy simply developed a tension beneath its skin, like a wound that had healed incorrectly. Veterans spoke of it in hushed tones. Astropaths tried to describe it and failed. Navigators felt it most of all, because it lived where their third eyes gazed, between thought and reality. Something was misaligned. Not broken, not collapsing, misaligned. Time began to behave inconsistently, though never violently enough to provoke alarm. Ships arrived days late, then weeks early. Entire campaigns were fought against enemies who seemed to know the outcome before the first shot was fired. In rare, deeply unsettling cases, Imperial forces encountered wreckage from battles that had not yet taken place, burned-out hulls bearing their own heraldry, drifting in cold silence like accusations from the future. The Administratum labeled these anomalies as temporal distortion, an accepted hazard of warp travel. But the distortions were no longer confined to the warp. They bled into real space. On Hive worlds, workers would lose hours without explanation, finding themselves mid-task with no memory of starting it. Children spoke of dreams where they lived entire lifetimes and woke unchanged. Old men remembered events that official records insisted had never happened. The past grew unreliable. The future grew repetitive. History itself began to feel worn thin, as though reality was being revised not to improve it, but to simplify it. Astropaths suffered in ways they could not articulate. Their visions, once a cacophony of screaming souls and fractured images, grew strangely coherent. The warp no longer assaulted them indiscriminately. It whispered in patterns. Messages overlapped, echoed, sometimes repeated themselves word for word, as if the Immaterium was testing how much redundancy the mind could endure before it broke. Some astropaths claimed they could feel attention. Not malice, not hunger, observation. They were silenced quickly, not by execution, but by reassignment, isolation, or simple disbelief. The Imperium had always treated psychic testimony as both sacred and disposable. There was no protocol for a warp that listened. Faith, too, began to behave unpredictably. Miracles still occurred, but not where they were expected. A devout shrine world prayed for deliverance and received nothing. A forgotten mining colony muttered half-remembered litanies and found its sick healed overnight. Saints appeared in places where doctrine said they should not, delivering messages that were maddeningly ambiguous. The ecclesiarchy struggled to interpret these signs, because they no longer aligned with hierarchy or obedience. Belief still mattered. It just no longer obeyed the rules. Even the Adeptus Astartes were not immune. Librarians felt their psychic disciplines respond sluggishly, as if reality itself hesitated before answering them. Warp entities bound within wards behaved differently, not weaker, but more deliberate. They remembered previous bindings. They anticipated rituals before they were completed. Some even waited politely, which disturbed their captors far more than violence ever had. Among the most ancient space marines, those who had fought since before entire chapters were founded, a quiet dread took root. They sensed it during long periods of stillness, on watch decks overlooking the void, in the empty moments between battles. A pressure behind the eyes. A thought that felt borrowed. This war is no longer about victory. No chaplain ever recorded such words. No confession ever preserved them. But they spread anyway, unspoken, carried in shared glances and longer silences. The warp itself began to feel closer. Not intruding, not erupting, just adjacent, as if the boundary between the material and immaterial realms had thinned so gradually that no one noticed it happening. Demons did not claw their way into existence anymore. They stepped through, already formed, already understanding the physics they now occupied. Reality bent around them without protest. On some worlds, the laws of causality loosened just enough to be noticeable. People survived injuries that should have killed them, only to die later of minor wounds. Machines functioned despite impossible damage, then failed catastrophically without warning. Probability skewed, not toward chaos, but toward meaninglessness. Outcomes ceased to correlate with effort or virtue. This was the most corrosive change of all. Because a universe where actions no longer guarantee results is a universe where purpose erodes. The Ordo Malleus convened in secret, compiling reports they could not reconcile. They searched for a grand incursion, a hidden crusade, a unifying thread behind these anomalies. They found none. There was no enemy to point to. No war to declare, just a slow, creeping sense that reality itself was becoming indifferent to resistance. And indifference was not something the Imperium knew how to fight. Across the galaxy, small, almost laughable incidents accumulated. A world declared heretical not for worshipping chaos, but for ceasing all religious practice entirely. A regiment executed for refusing to chant battle prayers, claiming the words felt empty. A cathedral that collapsed inward without structural failure, its stones folding like paper around an absence at its center. No demons were found, no corruption detected, no explanation offered. The warp was no longer screaming. It was listening, and listening changes things. When the fabric of reality began to echo with thoughts that were not entirely human, the most dangerous realization started to form, one the Imperium would never allow itself to fully articulate. Chaos was not overwhelming the galaxy through force or temptation anymore. It was synchronizing with it. Humanity had spent millennia shaping the warp through fear, faith, hatred, and hope. Now the warp was shaping humanity back, smoothing its extremes, narrowing its expectations, teaching it how to exist comfortably within endless conflict and endless decay. This was not possession, this was adaptation, and adaptation meant survival, which meant that, slowly and without ceremony, the galaxy was becoming a place where chaos did not need to invade, because it already belonged. By the time the question began to surface in the minds of the most perceptive souls, what if the universe itself has chosen chaos, it was already too late to answer it. Because the universe had stopped caring whether anyone noticed at all. What if the gods stopped fighting each other, not out of unity, but understanding? There was no great council in the warp, no throne room where the powers of chaos gathered to swear oaths or forge alliances. Such concepts were too rigid, too human. And yet, across the Imperium, something unprecedented occurred. The endless rivalries, the feuds that had torn reality apart since the birth of the gods, did not end. They simply became irrelevant. The gods did not agree. They aligned. It began subtly, in ways that even the denizens of the warp struggled to comprehend. Demonic hosts that once annihilated each other on sight now passed without conflict, their hungers momentarily satisfied elsewhere. Domains that had once bled into one another in violent contradiction stabilized along clearer borders. The Imperium stopped behaving like a battlefield and began behaving like a system, one governed not by harmony, but by efficiency. Khorne noticed first, though he would never have named it as such. Endless war had reached a saturation point. Battle followed battle with no escalation, no finality, no crescendo. Rage, when sustained without purpose, became dull. The blood god did not grow weaker, but he grew patient. He allowed wars to stall. Sieges that lasted centuries, conflicts where victory was mathematically impossible. He learned that hatred burned longer when it was denied release. Nurgle followed, delighted in his own way. The galaxy had grown accustomed to suffering. Disease no longer arrived as apocalyptic plagues, it arrived as infrastructure. Entire populations learned to live with decay as a constant companion. Hope rotted slowly, deliciously. Despair ripened best when it was not acute, but chronic. Nurgle's garden flourished not in catastrophe, but in routine misery. Tzeentch, architect of change, found something curious. The fewer meaningful choices left in the galaxy, the easier it was to control outcomes. When every path led to some form of damnation, prophecy became reliable. Schemes no longer needed complexity. The future narrowed. Possibility collapsed inward. Change itself became predictable, and therefore exploitable. Even Slaanesh, youngest and most volatile of the gods, adapted. Excess lost its edge when indulgence became ubiquitous. Pleasure dulled. Sensation flattened. So Slaanesh turned inward, feeding on obsession, on longing without satisfaction, on the endless chase for feeling in a universe that had numbed itself against pain and joy alike. Each god adjusted independently, but the result was the same. They stopped interfering with each other's work. Not out of truce, not out of cooperation, but because interference was inefficient. Their domains overlapped just enough to sustain the warp's ecosystem without destabilizing it. Conflict still existed, but it was curated, managed. The Imperium no longer tore itself apart in paroxysms of contradiction. It flowed, and that flow pressed against reality like a rising tide. This was the pact that was never spoken. The Imperium never noticed. How could it? The High Lords were trained to look for enemies in motion, not equilibrium. The Inquisition hunted heresies that grew too fast, not ideologies that spread slowly enough to seem natural. The Imperium expected chaos to be loud, flamboyant, unmistakable. It had no doctrine for an enemy that chose subtlety over spectacle. As the warp stabilized, reality suffered consequences it could not name. Warp storms no longer raged randomly. They lingered. They settled into predictable regions, turning entire sectors into permanent isolation zones. These were written off as lost territories, sacrificed for the greater good. No one questioned why the storms did not expand further, or why they seemed content to remain exactly where they were. Demons manifested with unprecedented clarity. Their forms were sharper, their presence less corrosive. They did not unravel physics around them, they integrated into it. Weapons struck them with consistent effect. Wards held more reliably. For the first time, chaos seemed understandable. And understanding bred complacency. The most dangerous consequence of this alignment was not strategic. It was philosophical. For the first time, chaos stopped representing pure opposition to order. It became an alternative structure. One that did not promise salvation or annihilation, only continuation. Endless war, endless decay, endless desire, endless change, all balanced just enough to sustain themselves forever. The warp was no longer trying to destroy reality. It was trying to replace it. Humanity felt this shift, without realizing what it meant. Cult activity became less dramatic, more institutional. Heresy no longer wore symbols, it wore uniforms. Chaos did not demand rebellion. It rewarded adaptation. Worlds that leaned into despair found stability. Worlds that embraced endless conflict found purpose. Worlds that surrendered to numb indulgence found peace of a sort. These worlds did not scream. They endured. And endurance, in a galaxy that worshipped survival above all else, looked dangerously like success. Somewhere deep within the warp, the gods became aware of a final, unavoidable truth. A realization that transcended rivalry, hunger, and ambition. Chaos did not need to defeat the Emperor. It needed to outlast him. As long as the Imperium struggled, as long as it fought with no hope of victory and no memory of why it began, it would continue to feed the warp. Every prayer, every scream, every act of defiance sustained the balance. The Emperor on his throne was not an obstacle, he was a dam, holding back a flood by constantly leaking into it. And dams do not need to be destroyed. They only need time. So the gods waited, not as conquerors, but as heirs, because when the moment finally came, when the last resistance faltered, when the struggle lost its meaning, when survival itself became empty, the galaxy would not fall into chaos in fire or madness. It would simply realize it had already been living there all along. What happens when the words that once defined reality stop meaning what they were meant to mean? The collapse did not announce itself with treason or revelation. It arrived through language. At first, it was subtle. So subtle that no single institution noticed it happening. The word loyalty began to stretch. It no longer meant obedience to Terra, it meant survival of one's world. Heresy no longer meant worship of forbidden gods, it meant disruption of stability. Faith was no longer conviction, it was habit. Recited, repeated, expected. The Imperium had always relied on rigid definitions to hold itself together. When those definitions softened, the structure began to bend. And bending, in time, becomes breaking. Planetary governors discovered that they could ignore certain edicts without consequence. Not openly, not defiantly, they simply delayed, reinterpreted, filed reports that technically complied while achieving nothing. Segmentum commands contradicted each other more frequently, and instead of resolving the conflicts, administrators learned to work around them. Authority became negotiable, not because chaos demanded it, but because the Imperium no longer had the strength to enforce absolutes. This was not rebellion, it was ambiguity. Entire systems existed in a gray state, neither loyal nor traitor, neither compliant nor condemned. They paid tithes when they could. They raised regiments when convenient. They worshipped the Emperor in form, if not in certainty. The Imperium tolerated this because it had no alternative. A dying empire cannot afford purity. Chaos understood this perfectly. In these uncertain spaces, cult activity flourished, not as fanatic movements, but as social frameworks. They did not preach damnation or glory. They offered structure, mutual aid, purpose. In worlds where the Imperium had become distant and abstract, chaos became local. Personal, familiar. The gods were not named. They did not need to be. Their influence manifested as acceptance of suffering, glorification of endless struggle, surrender to decay, or pursuit of sensation as distraction. No horns, no summoning circles, just people adapting. The Adeptus Astartes, once the Imperium's unshakable pillars, felt this erosion more keenly than most. Chapters began to interpret their oaths differently. Some defined loyalty as defense of humanity rather than obedience to Terra. Others withdrew entirely, retreating to fortress monasteries to wage private wars against threats only they recognized. A few, dangerously few, concluded that the Imperium itself had become an obstacle to survival. They did not fall screaming into damnation. They revised their mission parameters. These were not the obvious traitors of legend. Not the frothing berserkers or warp-twisted monstrosities. These were disciplined warriors who still maintained their wargear, their rituals, their heraldry. They fought chaos where it threatened their chosen worlds, and ignored it where it did not. They fought the Imperium when it interfered, and justified it as necessity. The line between loyalist and heretic blurred not because chaos erased it, but because reality made it inconvenient. Even the Inquisition fractured under this pressure. Ordos disagreed not over doctrine, but over priorities. Was a stable, heretical world preferable to a loyal one on the brink of collapse? Was extermination still purity if it reduced humanity's chances of survival? Radical inquisitors once hunted in secret now found their methods quietly tolerated. Not approved, but useful. The greatest irony was that chaos did not demand these compromises. The galaxy offered them freely. As meaning eroded, so did narrative. The Imperium had always survived by telling itself a story. Humanity against the darkness, order against madness, the Emperor against the gods. But stories require contrast. When everything becomes struggle, when war never changes, when victory is temporary and defeat is survivable, the story loses its shape. People stopped believing the Imperium would win. They started believing it would continue. And continuation, stripped of hope, is another form of despair. The warp reflected this change immediately. The emotions feeding it grew flatter. Less intense. More constant. Chaos did not swell with sudden surges of devotion or terror. It was sustained by background radiation of hopeless endurance. The immaterium became less volatile, more saturated. It no longer lashed out. It pressed inward, reinforcing the emotional equilibrium it was being fed. This was the true danger. Because a chaos that thrives on extremes can be resisted by moderation. A chaos that thrives on normalcy cannot. Saints began to fail. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Their miracles grew inconsistent. Their visions contradictory. Some saints preached messages that directly conflicted with imperial doctrine, calls for mercy where none could be afforded, acceptance where condemnation was required. The ecclesiarchy declared them false, even as their cults grew. Faith fractured along emotional lines rather than theological ones. Belief became personal, and personal belief is impossible to police. On the fringes of space, entire populations stopped praying altogether, not out of defiance, but exhaustion. The Emperor became a symbol of distant endurance rather than divine intervention. People still knelt, still chanted, but they no longer expected answers. This quiet resignation fed the warp in ways no screaming cult ever could. Because resignation accepts the world as it is, reality itself began to mirror this loss of meaning. Cause an effect weakened, heroic sacrifices failed to change outcomes. Cowardice was not punished, effort and reward drifted apart. When the universe stops responding to virtue, morality becomes a burden rather than a guide. Chaos did not enforce this shift. It benefited from it. By the time scholars, those few still permitted to think abstractly, began to articulate the fear that haunted them, it was already too late to act on it. They realized that chaos was no longer defined by corruption. It was defined by compatibility. The galaxy no longer recoiled from chaos because chaos no longer contradicted it. Endless war, endless decay, endless desire, endless manipulation, these were not invasions. They were reflections. The warp had become a mirror held up to a civilization that had forgotten how to imagine peace, growth, or meaning beyond survival. And mirrors do not lie. They only show what is already there. Somewhere deep within the Imperium's collapsing archives, a forbidden hypothesis was recorded and immediately sealed. It proposed that chaos had not won by overpowering humanity, but by aligning with its most fundamental truth, that a species forged in endless war would eventually find endless war comforting. When that hypothesis was erased, no one noticed. Because by then, the galaxy no longer asked what it was fighting for. It only asked how long it could keep fighting. And chaos, patient and eternal, already knew the answer. What happens when the heart of an empire still beats, but no one listens to it anymore? Terra did not fall. That was the cruelest part. Its skies were still choked with traffic. Its continents still buried beneath layers of stone, steel, and history. The Golden Throne still consumed lives at its ancient, unrelenting pace. The High Lords still convened, still argued, still issued decrees written in the language of absolute authority. On every official record, Terra remained the center of the galaxy. In reality, it had become an echo. Orders left the Sol system and vanished into the void, not lost to warp storms or enemy action, but to irrelevance. Segmentum commanders received directives months or years too late, only to discover they contradicted decisions already made on the ground. Some followed them anyway, out of habit. Others ignored them quietly. A few never received them at all. Communication had become a suggestion rather than a command. The Imperium did not fracture in rebellion. It drifted. Governors who once would have trembled at the thought of disobedience began acting independently, not because they sought power, but because waiting for Terra meant death. Supplies rerouted themselves. Fleets responded to local threats rather than distant crusades. Worlds learned to survive without permission. At first, this decentralization was celebrated as resilience, proof that humanity could endure even when stretched thin. Guilliman himself argued that adaptation was not heresy, that flexibility was the only way the Imperium could survive another millennium. His words carried weight, for a time, but flexibility, once normalized, does not remain controlled. It spreads. Soon, entire subsectors operated on their own interpretations of imperial law. The Lex Imperialis fractured into regional doctrines. Punishments varied wildly for the same crimes. Faith was enforced strictly on some worlds and loosely on others. The Emperor was worshipped as a god, a martyr, a symbol, or simply a distant ancestor, depending on local necessity. No one officially sanctioned these differences. No one stopped them either. The authority of Terra had always depended on two things: fear and faith. Fear of retribution, faith in legitimacy. As warp travel grew more erratic and enforcement more expensive, fear weakened. As miracles faltered and doctrine blurred, faith followed. Terra still ruled in name, but names no longer carried the weight they once had. The Adeptus Terra noticed the change, but could not reverse it. Every attempt at reasserting control required resources the Imperium no longer had. Every show of force created vacuums elsewhere. To crush independence in one sector was to abandon another to collapse, or worse. Chaos did not need to intervene. The Imperium was cannibalizing its own cohesion. Rabute Guilliman saw it more clearly than anyone else. He had rebuilt empires before. He understood logistics, governance, compromise. And for a time, he believed that the Imperium's fragmentation could be guided, that autonomy could exist within unity. What he did not anticipate was that unity itself had lost meaning. He traveled from world to world, issuing reforms, restructuring command chains, offering clarity where there had been confusion. And everywhere he went, he was obeyed, publicly. Privately, his orders were weighed against local realities. Followed when convenient, adjusted when necessary, ignored when dangerous, not out of defiance, out of exhaustion. The galaxy was too large, too damaged, too tired to care who ruled it, as long as someone did. In some regions, the Imperium effectively ceased to exist as a singular entity. Instead, clusters of worlds formed their own defensive coalitions, their own trade networks, their own interpretations of survival. They still claimed imperial allegiance. They still flew Aquilas. But Terra was no longer the source of their identity, it was a distant myth, invoked only when useful. Chaos flourished in these spaces of soft authority, not by overthrowing rulers, but by becoming indispensable to them. A governor who bargained for stability instead of victory found their world spared from warp storms. A commander who tolerated unorthodox allies found their campaigns miraculously successful. These were not open pacts. No demonic contracts signed in blood. Just patterns that rewarded compromise and punished idealism. Over time, Terra's proclamations began to sound naive. Calls for purity rang hollow in a galaxy that survived on compromise. Declarations of eternal war felt meaningless when no one remembered the purpose of the war. The Emperor's name was still spoken with reverence, but increasingly as a symbol of endurance rather than guidance. The Imperium had always claimed to be eternal. Now it was merely persistent. And persistence without direction is decay. The greatest tragedy was that Terra still believed itself necessary. The High Lords debated succession, doctrine, reform, unaware that the galaxy had already begun living without their answers. They were caretakers of a throne that still existed, but no longer anchored reality. When historians of this final age, those few who survived long enough to reflect, would look back, they would not mark the Imperium's fall at a single battle or betrayal. They would mark it here, The moment when the center held. And no one cared anymore. Because an empire does not truly die when its capital burns. It dies when its voice becomes background noise. And in that quiet, spreading silence, chaos did not need to speak at all. It was already being heard everywhere else. What happens when the warriors created to defend eternity begin redefining what eternity means? The Space Marines did not fall together. That, too, was a lie the Imperium told itself to feel safer. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Astartes had been the one constant in a galaxy of decay, genetically engineered certainty wrapped in ceramite and faith. They were not merely soldiers, they were symbols. As long as the Space Marines stood loyal, the Imperium believed it still possessed a spine. But symbols fracture when the meaning behind them fractures first. The earliest signs were easy to dismiss. A chapter that delayed answering a summons. Another that declined to join a crusade, citing local threats of greater urgency. A third that vanished entirely into the void, its last transmission curt, formal, and final. None of these acts were unprecedented. Space Marines had always been autonomous. They had always made hard choices. What changed was why they made them. Some chapters began to interpret their oaths in increasingly narrow terms. They would defend humanity, but only the humanity directly under their protection. They would fight chaos, but only when it threatened what they deemed essential. The Imperium, to them, had become an abstraction, too vast, too compromised, too inefficient to be worth unconditional loyalty. These chapters did not declare independence. They simply stopped asking permission. Others went further. They concluded that the Imperium itself, bloated, stagnant, endlessly demanding sacrifice without progress, was accelerating humanity's extinction. To fight for such a system, they reasoned, was to serve entropy, not order. They still fought enemies of mankind. They still exterminated Xenos and demons alike. But when Imperial forces stood in their way, they did not hesitate. They called it necessity. The Inquisition called it heresy. Neither word captured the truth. Then there were the isolationists. Chapters that sealed their fortress monasteries, withdrew their fleets, and ceased external operations almost entirely. They trained. They prayed. They prepared. For what? They never said. Perhaps for a final war. Perhaps for judgment. Perhaps for a reality in which the Imperium no longer existed to command them. Their silence was more unsettling than open rebellion. A few chapters, ancient and proud, attempted to hold the line as it had always been. They answered every call. They followed every order. They fought and died in numbers that could no longer be replaced. Their gene seed stocks dwindled. Their companies thinned. Their traditions became elegies rather than living practices. They were loyal, and loyalty was killing them. Chaos watched all of this with quiet fascination. It did not need to seduce the Astartes with promises of power. That path had been exhausted millennia ago. The obvious traitors, the screaming berserkers, the warped zealots, were relics of a cruder age. This new era demanded something subtler. Chaos offered clarity. To chapters drowning in contradiction, chaos presented a universe that made sense. Endless war had purpose again. Decay was honest. Desire was acknowledged rather than suppressed. Change was inevitable instead of denied. Some Space Marines, exhausted by lies they could no longer believe, stepped across the line not in rage, but in relief. Their fall was terrifyingly quiet. They did not mutilate themselves. They did not abandon discipline. They did not even renounce their past. They simply revised their understanding of it. The Emperor became a failed architect rather than a god. The Imperium became a cautionary tale rather than a sacred trust. Chaos became not an enemy, but a truth the galaxy had always been moving toward. When these Space Marines turned their guns on their former brothers, they did so without hatred. That absence of hatred was what broke morale. Brotherhood had once been the Imperium's strongest weapon. Now it became its deepest wound. Loyalists could no longer trust that the warrior beside them shared the same definition of duty. Every joint operation carried uncertainty. Every shared victory carried suspicion. The Astartes had always been terrifying to their enemies. Now they were terrifying to each other. The Imperium attempted to respond with doctrine, with censure, with force. Entire chapters were declared renegade on fragmentary evidence. Loyal forces were ordered to hunt warriors they had once trained beside. Old grudges resurfaced. Ancient rivalries reignited. Chaos did not need to orchestrate these conflicts. It only needed to let them happen. As the divide deepened, the myth of the Space Marines began to crack among the civilian population. Once seen saviors became unpredictable. Angels of death arrived, and sometimes left devastation behind them. Trust eroded, fear replaced reverence. The symbol that had held the Imperium together began to inspire doubt, and doubt feeds the warp. The most tragic truth was this: many of the Space Marines who broke away did so believing they were saving humanity. Many of those who remained loyal knew, deep down, that the Imperium they defended no longer resembled the dream it claimed to protect. Both sides were right, and both sides were doomed. Because a warrior caste divided over the meaning of its own existence cannot hold a galaxy together. The Adeptus Astartes had been designed to fight enemies without and within, but not to survive a universe where the definition of enemy no longer held. Chaos did not destroy the Space Marines. It let them redefine themselves until unity became impossible. And as the angels of death turned their gaze inward, the galaxy lost the last force capable of imposing coherence through strength alone. What remained was power without consensus, violence without direction, and a war that no longer knew whose side it was on. What happens when even the alien minds that once stood apart begin to recognize the same ending? The fall was never meant to belong to humanity alone. For a time, the Imperium comforted itself with the belief that chaos was its curse, born of human emotion, fed by human excess, contained by human suffering. Xenos were enemies, rivals, obstacles, but they were external to the great spiritual war tearing the galaxy apart. That belief did not survive contact with reality. Because the moment chaos stopped behaving like a predator and began behaving like a constant, every thinking species felt it. The Eldar were the first to understand, and the first to realize how completely they had failed. They had seen this future in fragments, scattered across their infinity circuits and whispered by farseers who dared not speak too clearly. Not a single apocalypse, not a great devouring catastrophe, but a long, thinning twilight where resistance lost its meaning. The Eldar had always feared chaos as a consequence of excess, a reflection of their own ancient sin. What they now perceived was worse. Chaos no longer needed excess. It no longer needed them. Craftworld seers watched the strands of fate converge, not into catastrophe, but into inevitability. Futures no longer branched wildly. They narrowed. The Eldar could still see tomorrow, but tomorrow looked the same no matter what they did. Victory delayed nothing. Sacrifice changed nothing. Even survival felt temporary, like a footnote written in advance. The most ancient among them recognized the truth they could barely endure. Chaos had learned from the fall. It had learned restraint. It had learned patience. It would never overindulge again, not when a slow starvation of meaning yielded more power. Some Eldar chose denial. Others embraced fatalism. A few, driven to desperation, attempted to manipulate events on a galactic scale, nudging wars here, assassinations there, hoping to reintroduce volatility into fate itself. These efforts failed, not because they were thwarted, but because the universe absorbed them without reaction. The galaxy had become inert. Even the Dark Eldar, masters of cruelty and excess, felt it. Comorig still screamed with agony and indulgence, but the screams carried less resonance. Pain no longer refreshed them as it once had. Sensation dulled. Their eternal hunger sharpened, not for suffering, but for novelty, which the universe increasingly refused to provide. Chaos had made excess mundane, and that terrified the only species that had ever truly mastered it. The Necrons perceived the shift with cold clarity. To them, chaos had always been an aberration, a psychic infection infesting a universe that should have been purely material. Their ancient war against the Old Ones had been fought, in part, to prevent exactly this kind of reality contamination. And now, as they awoke from eons of slumber, they found the galaxy not conquered by chaos, but acclimated to it. This disturbed them far more than open war ever could. Necron Cryptex observed that the warp was no longer expanding chaotically. It was stabilizing, integrating. The boundaries between real space and immaterial energy no longer fluctuated wildly, they settled. This was not corruption, it was coexistence. To the Necrons, this represented an existential threat beyond comprehension. A universe where the warp could no longer be cleanly excised was a universe permanently flawed. Their technologies, designed to suppress and nullify psychic phenomena, still functioned, but with diminishing returns. The Immaterium was no longer an intruder. It was becoming a layer of reality itself. For the first time since their biotransference, the Necrons faced a future they could not simply outwait. Some dynasties proposed drastic measures, the total annihilation of all psychic life. Others suggested reality-scale weapons to collapse the warp entirely. Most of these plans were abandoned, not because they were impossible, but because they were no longer sufficient. Destroying chaos now would mean destroying the galaxy as it had become. Chaos had entrenched itself not as a tyrant, but as infrastructure. The orcs, by contrast, thrived. Endless war had always been their natural state, and a galaxy locked in perpetual conflict suited them perfectly. Wars rose and fell, clashing against imperial remnants, chaos warbands, and each other with joyful abandon. The orcs did not question meaning. They did not suffer from erosion of purpose. If anything, the endless, directionless violence invigorated them. But even here, something was off. Veteran orcs, those rare few capable of something approaching reflection, noticed that the fights felt flatter. Less climactic. Battles blurred together. Victories no longer led to greater challenges. The galaxy gave them war without escalation, violence without narrative. For orcs, that was unsettling. The Tyranids felt at last. The hive mind, vast beyond comprehension, probed the galaxy not with curiosity, but hunger. And for the first time since it had entered the galactic plane, that hunger hesitated. Psychic resonance, a key component of its navigation and adaptation, had changed. The warp no longer screamed with distinct emotional signatures. It hummed with uniformity. This made prey harder to define. Worlds saturated with chaos energy were nutritionally unstable. Biomass harvested from them carried psychic residues that disrupted assimilation. Adaptation became inefficient. Consumption yielded diminishing returns. The hive mind recoiled, not in fear, but in calculation. A galaxy fully claimed by chaos would be a galaxy not worth eating. And so, on the fringes of known space, Tyranid tendrils slowed. Redirected. Waited. The great devourer, embodiment of endless hunger, recognized something it had never encountered before. A universe where consumption was no longer profitable. Across all species, across all empires and instincts, the same realization emerged in different forms. Chaos was no longer an opponent. It was no longer even a conqueror. It was the environment. You could fight it, but you would be fighting the conditions of existence itself. You could flee it, but there was nowhere left untouched. You could attempt to destroy it, but only by destroying everything that now depended on it. The galaxy had crossed a threshold, and from that moment on, no war, human or otherwise, was truly about winning anymore. They were all about adaptation. And chaos had already adapted first. What happens when the galaxy believes it has won, only to discover the victory was a trap? It was the most dangerous illusion the Imperium had ever faced. Because for the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy experienced something it had almost forgotten, a sense of progress. It began with a series of small, almost insignificant events that were later remembered as the beginning of the great counteroffensive. A series of warp storms broke. A chain of demon incursions ceased. A handful of long-lost worlds re-established contact. A few crusades met with success, more than the Imperium had seen in generations. For the first time, the word victory stopped sounding like a myth. In the halls of Terra, the High Lords felt it in their bones. The air of dread that had always clung to the throne world loosened. For the first time in centuries, there was laughter, thin and rare, but real. The Adeptus Mechanicus reported improved production. The Adeptus Astartes returned from campaigns with fewer losses. The Imperial Navy claimed new gains. Gilliman, the only Primarch still bound to the Imperium's fate, spoke of a turning point. He called it the beginning of the Second Age of Redemption. He believed, with the certainty of a man who had rebuilt empires before, that the Imperium could reclaim its lost glory. He believed the tide had turned. The people believed it too. In the hive cities, priests preached that the Emperor's light had returned. In the battlefields, soldiers fought with renewed vigor, convinced that their deaths would finally mean something. Across the galaxy, the word hope began to be spoken again, not as a prayer for survival, but as a promise of triumph. And chaos, patient as it always was, allowed this belief to flourish. Not because it feared the Imperium. Because it needed the Imperium to believe it had won. Because the great counteroffensive was not a military resurgence. It was a harvest. Chaos had spent centuries shaping the galaxy into a machine that produced a particular kind of energy. Not the energy of worship, not the energy of fear, not the energy of rebellion, but the energy of desperation turning into faith. Chaos had learned that when a civilization believes it is about to be saved, its faith becomes sharper, its prayers louder, its devotion more concentrated. It is in those moments, when hope is highest, that belief becomes most potent. So the gods orchestrated a period of false victory. Not by invading, not by forcing, but by allowing the Imperium to win enough that it believed in winning again. The warp responded to this surge of belief like a star to fuel. The Astronomicon brightened, warp roots stabilized, the Emperor's presence, faint and distant for so long, seemed to strengthen. Pilgrimages resumed, the faithful returned to cathedrals with tears in their eyes. For a while, the galaxy seemed to heal. But healing, in the Imperium, was always temporary. Because the moment hope peaked, it became vulnerable to collapse. The counteroffensive pushed deeper into the Eye of Terror. The Imperium reclaimed worlds once thought lost forever. The faithful rejoiced. The Imperial Navy sang. Space Marines returned with trophies. The Emperor's name was spoken with reverence not just as a deity, but as a deliverer. Then the warp shifted, not violently, not dramatically, just enough, a subtle change in tone, a slight distortion in the Astronomicon's glow, a new pattern in the dreams of the faithful, the kind of change that would have been dismissed as superstition if it hadn't coincided with the moment the Imperium began to believe its victory was inevitable. The first signs of the trap appeared in the conquered worlds, not as demonic uprisings, not as rebellion, but as a slow, creeping malaise. People who had prayed for liberation began to experience a strange emptiness. Their joy felt forced, their gratitude felt hollow. They spoke of feeling watched, not by enemies, but by something they could not name. Then, as the Imperium pushed further, the warp began to behave in a new way. It did not resist the Imperium. It guided it. Pilots reported navigational routes that were too perfect. Astropaths received messages that seemed to predict enemy movements before they happened. Battles ended with uncanny efficiency. It was as if the galaxy itself was clearing a path, making way for the Imperium's advance. The commanders called it divine favor. The Inquisition called it a miracle. Chaos called it a harvest. The Imperium, blinded by the sweetness of progress, failed to see the true cost. Every victory, every reclaimed world, every recovered shrine, strengthened the faith of billions. Faith fed the warp fed the gods. The gods, in turn, made victory seem possible. It was a feedback loop designed to create a single outcome, a peak of belief so intense that it could not be sustained. The moment the Imperium reached the deepest point of its advance, the warp shifted again. The Astronomicon flickered, warp storms erupted in previously stable routes. Demonic incursions resumed, not in great armies, but in precise, surgical strikes. The Imperium's victories began to unravel, and in that unraveling, the trap was revealed. The great counteroffensive had not weakened chaos. It had strengthened it. The gods had not retreated. They had gathered. They had waited. They had allowed humanity to believe it was winning, because the energy produced by that belief was far more valuable than the energy produced by despair. In the moments before the trap snapped shut, the Imperium experienced something it had not felt in millennia. The certainty of a future. Then the certainty vanished. The war continued, but the war was no longer a struggle between two forces. It was a cosmic mechanism designed to extract the last remaining ounce of human devotion. And the Imperium, starving for meaning, fed it willingly. What happens when the last light begins to fade, quietly, without the drama of a final battle? The Golden Throne did not explode. It did not shatter in a blaze of celestial fury. There was no triumphant moment for chaos, no banner raised atop a ruined palace. The end came in the most humiliating way possible, through wear and tear. The machine that had sustained the Emperor for 10,000 years was ancient beyond comprehension. It was built on technology and faith so intertwined that separating them was impossible. The throne had been maintained by a system of sacrifices and rituals that had become ritualistic without being understood. The Adeptus Mechanicus had long ago forgotten the original schematics. The priests had forgotten the original prayers. The machine continued to function because it had been running for so long that stopping it had become unthinkable. But nothing lasts forever. The first signs of failure were subtle. The Astronomicon dimmed in ways that were not dramatic enough to cause panic. It flickered, then steadied. It dimmed again, then returned. The High Lords issued reassurances. The Ecclesiarchy preached that the Emperor's will was unbroken. The Mechanicus declared that the throne was, within acceptable operational variance. The galaxy believed them, because the alternative was unbearable. The warp, however, did not need to be told. It felt the weakening immediately. The Immaterium, which had been adapting to the Imperium's endless war, sensed the loss of the Emperor's psychic anchor like a tide receding from the shore. The boundaries between real space and the warp thinned. Demons felt it too. Their manifestations became easier, their presence more stable. The barrier that had always been there, weak as it was, began to fail. The Imperium tried to respond in the only way it knew how, by fighting. But fighting does not repair a dying machine. The first major incident occurred when a fleet traveling through the Segmentum Solar reported a sudden surge of warp turbulence. The navigators screamed of being lost in a sea of emotions they could not name. The ship's astropath began to scream too, until the screams stopped. Not because he was dead, but because his mind had become silent. The vessel reappeared days later, drifting through real space as if it had never left. Its crew was intact, but their eyes were blank. They spoke no words. They moved without purpose. When they were interrogated, they could not describe what they had experienced. They only repeated one phrase, again and again. It's gone. The phrase spread like a plague. The Emperor is gone. The Astronomicon is gone. Terra is isolated. The High Lords refused to acknowledge the truth. They called it a temporary disruption. They called it an astropathic failure. They called it a warp phenomenon that would pass. But the truth did not pass. It spread. The Emperor's psychic presence, which had once been the galaxy's compass, faded. It did not vanish in a dramatic surge. It simply dimmed, like a candle left burning too long. The Imperium, built on the belief that the Emperor was watching, suddenly found itself in darkness. The effect was immediate. Without the Astronomicon, warp travel became nearly impossible. Fleets became trapped in the void. Supply lines snapped. Crusades stalled. Worlds that had been on the brink of salvation fell into isolation, left to starve or to be consumed by their own internal conflicts. The Imperium, which had always depended on its ability to project power across the stars, found itself reduced to scattered pockets of survival. The loss of the Emperor's presence did not just affect travel. It affected belief. Faith is not merely a spiritual force. In the Imperium, faith is infrastructure. It is the glue that holds society together. It is the fuel that powers the machine. When the Emperor's psychic light faded, the faith of billions began to falter. Miracles became rare. Saints fell silent. Prayers echoed back without answer. The ecclesiarchy responded with desperation. They increased sermons. They intensified rituals. They demanded more sacrifices. They promised that the Emperor's will was still strong, that his light had simply gone through a trial, that the faithful must endure. But faith cannot be commanded into existence. Faith must be earned, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium offered nothing but silence. The Inquisition began to hunt for heresy with renewed zeal. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to blame for the Emperor's silence. They targeted those who had doubted, those who had questioned, those who had suggested that the throne was failing. They burned them as a warning to the rest. But the burnings only made the silence louder. Because people began to wonder, if the Emperor is still watching, why does he allow this? The answer, when it finally came, was not spoken by the High Lords. It was felt. Across the galaxy, in the minds of the most attuned psychers, a final message emerged. Not a message of hope. Not a message of victory. A message of choice. The Emperor, in the last moments of his awareness, did not plead for salvation. He did not issue orders. He did not curse the gods. He simply chose. He chose to let go. He chose oblivion. He chose to stop feeding the machine that had kept him alive for 10,000 years. He understood something the Imperium would never accept, that as long as he remained, the Imperium would continue to exist as a war machine, forever trapped in an endless cycle of suffering. His continued survival had become a form of imprisonment for humanity. He was the anchor that held the galaxy to a future of constant conflict. And the moment he released that anchor, the galaxy finally began to drift. The Golden Throne died quietly. Not in a blaze, not in a final heroic act. Just in a long, tired silence. The Imperium did not collapse in a single day. It collapsed in the way a civilization collapses when it realizes its god has abandoned it. It fractured into isolated pockets of survival, each convinced that their struggle was still meaningful. Each convinced that the Emperor was still watching. Each clinging to the idea that their suffering had a purpose. And in that moment, chaos did not need to conquer. Chaos simply became the only force left capable of offering answers. Because the warp, now unopposed, became louder. And in the noise, the gods of chaos finally found what they had been waiting for. Not victory, but freedom. What happens